After the war's end, Japan faced an uncertain future. Its war factories, once the driving force behind its military might, now idle and irrelevant. These industrial giants, which had produced everything from planes to tanks, now stood as silent reminders of a past that could no longer be embraced. The challenge ahead was daunting. How could Japan repurpose or dismantle its wartime factories without further crippling its shattered economy? In the ruins of these massive production plants, a quiet transformation began. Yet the journey from war machine to civilian industry was anything but straightforward, and for many, it became a story of lost pride, wasted potential, and a painful reckoning with the past. After the guns fell silent, the world was left to confront the magnitude of the devastation wrought by the Second World War. But amid the rubble of destroyed cities and the charred remains of combat, a quieter, less visible struggle began. It was a struggle not for survival, but for the reintegration of entire nations into the global economy. For Japan, this was especially poignant. The country had mobilized its industry to fuel an ever-expanding war effort. Factories, built with precision and purpose, had hummed day and night to produce everything from military aircraft to ships, to tanks and weapons. These factories were not just the backbone of Japan's war machine, they had become its very identity. But when the war ended, so too did their purpose. With the surrender of Japan in August 1945, those same factories, once vital to the war effort, now faced a very different fate. The question that lingered was simple: what would become of these industrial giants now that they no longer served their original function? The answer was far from straightforward. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's defeat, the nation was in disarray. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and the industrial infrastructure that had once been dedicated to the war was now an anchor weighing down the future. The Japanese government, still reeling from the loss, had little control over the situation. Instead, the fate of these war factories was dictated by external forces, chiefly the American occupation. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, the United States took charge of Japan's reconstruction. The first priority was clear: to demilitarize the country, stripping away any remaining vestiges of the war machine that had plunged Asia into chaos. The factories that had once produced weapons, planes, and tanks were now considered a threat. They represented the war and everything that had gone wrong. Yet, the sheer scale of the industry in Japan meant that simply shutting everything down was not feasible. These factories were not just military assets, they were massive engines of production, with hundreds of thousands of workers employed in them. The economy, dependent on these factories for jobs, could not afford a sudden collapse. The challenge was how to dismantle the war economy without triggering a wider social and economic catastrophe. The first step was the immediate cessation of war production. Factories once producing military aircraft like the Mitsubishi A-6M0, one of Japan's most famous warplanes, were ordered to halt production. These once highly specialized plants, capable of building complex machines of war, were now left with large quantities of unsold military goods and a workforce suddenly without purpose. But it wasn't just a matter of halting production. There was the monumental task of disposing of or repurposing the immense war machinery still in place. Military planes and tanks were not the only legacy of the war. They had been built alongside entire factories designed specifically to support them. At the same time, American officials in charge of Japan's demilitarization began to oversee the scrapping of military equipment. Large numbers of ships, aircraft, and weapons were systematically dismantled, either to be destroyed or repurposed for civilian use. The scale of this destruction was staggering. In just the first few years after the war, thousands of aircraft were disassembled, their parts melted down or sold off for scrap. The infamous Japanese aircraft carrier, the Shokaku, was dismantled in 1946, her parts repurposed for civilian use. This was not just a military loss. It was the loss of an entire technological infrastructure, one that had been designed with a single purpose in mind. Yet, not all factories were destroyed. Some were simply abandoned, left to decay in the wake of war. Among the more notorious of these abandoned sites were the massive Mitsubishi and Kawasaki aircraft plants in the cities of Nagoya and Kobe. These locations had once been the hubs of Japan's aviation industry, where cutting-edge technology was developed and produced. But now, they were ghost towns, empty shells of the past, their halls echoing with the sounds of silence instead of the hum of machinery. The fate of these abandoned factories was tied directly to the economic pressures of the time. Japan's post-war economy was in tatters. The country was cut off from the global market, and the government had limited means to stimulate industrial recovery. The war had left Japan economically isolated, with little access to the materials and resources necessary to kickstart production. As a result, many of these abandoned factories remained dormant for years. Some were left to decay entirely, the massive concrete structures slowly eroded by time, while others, especially in the more industrialized regions, were repurposed for non-military use. But this transformation was rarely seamless. The factories were designed with wartime production in mind, mass-producing military hardware, and to suddenly switch to civilian production was neither easy nor efficient. In Nagoya, for instance, the once thriving Mitsubishi aircraft plant was eventually repurposed for automotive manufacturing. But the transition wasn't instantaneous. It took time for the necessary changes to be made, and even then, the factories were often ill-equipped to handle the demands of peacetime production. Repurposing these factories was not just a matter of changing what was made, but of changing the very ethos that underpinned their existence. The transformation was as much psychological as it was material. The workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers in the military-industrial complex, had to adapt to an entirely different economic landscape, one that was no longer focused on national glory or military dominance, but on rebuilding and recovery. But for every factory that was successfully repurposed, there were many more that simply fell into ruin. The pressure to immediately dismantle war factories was a product of both necessity and ideology. The Japanese military-industrial complex had been one of the most advanced in the world, but it was also a symbol of a militaristic regime that had led Japan to disaster. The American occupiers, under orders to demilitarize Japan completely, were determined to ensure that these factories could never again contribute to Japan's war-making potential. The destruction was not limited to machines and materials. It was an ideological dismantling, an attempt to purge the nation of the symbols of militarism. For the Japanese people, this presented a deeply paradoxical reality. On one hand, the closure and destruction of these factories meant the end of a painful chapter. On the other, it represented the loss of jobs, economic opportunities, and a source of national pride. Many of the workers who had once labored in these plants now found themselves unemployed, and entire regions that had been built around the defense industry suddenly saw their economies collapse. There was no easy path forward for these workers, many of whom had lived their lives in the shadow of the military-industrial complex, and this transition would prove to be one of the most difficult aspects of Japan's post-war recovery. The process was slow and methodical, with the full scope of the transformation not becoming clear until the late 1940s. In the first few years, much of the effort was focused on ensuring that factories could not be turned back into instruments of war. Yet, as the years went on, it became clear that many of these sites would not be simply destroyed or left to rot. A new era of industrialization had begun. Japan, now under the watchful eye of its American occupiers, began the painstaking process of rebuilding. But in the shadows of this recovery lay the enormous weight of the war economy, a reminder of what had been lost. The early years of the post-war period were a time of uncertainty. Factories that had once been integral to the war effort were now sitting idle, their future uncertain. The immediate pressure to demilitarize was beginning to subside, but the aftermath of war left an indelible mark on Japan's industrial landscape. Would these factories ever truly find a new purpose? Or would they, like so many other remnants of the war, remain a painful reminder of Japan's past? The answer was still unfolding. The fate of Japan's war factories in the years immediately following the war was a complex process, not merely dictated by the destructive forces of the post-war environment, but by the delicate balance between rebuilding a shattered economy and ensuring that no part of the wartime industrial infrastructure could ever serve its original militaristic purpose again. While many factories were quickly dismantled or repurposed, others found themselves caught in a state of limbo, existing only as reminders of a past that Japan wanted to forget. The path they took varied widely, from outright destruction to slow abandonment, and in some cases, a complete reinvention. For much of the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, Japan's post-war economy remained in a precarious state. The country was under strict occupation by the United States, led by General Douglas MacArthur, whose main goal was to ensure Japan could never again build up a war machine. This included ensuring that factories and industrial infrastructure tied to military production were either dismantled, repurposed, or rendered obsolete. This directive applied across the board to aircraft plants, shipyards, ammunition factories, and the vast network of supply chains that had supported Japan's wartime economy. The American Occupation Administration, while needing to avoid further destabilizing the country, also had to strike a delicate balance between ensuring the survival of Japan's civilian industries and enforcing a sweeping demilitarization campaign. The first significant push for retooling Japan's factories came from this need to shift gears from war production to civilian output. But this shift was not immediate. For one thing, Japan's factories, especially the ones that had been producing cutting-edge military technology, were highly specialized. They had been designed to meet the exacting standards of military demand, and repurposing them for civilian production was a difficult task. The machinery inside these plants, honed for precision manufacturing in the production of tanks, planes, and warships, was not suited for the mass production of civilian goods. In many cases, the factories themselves were also physically ill-equipped to handle new industries that were emerging in Japan's recovery. The most iconic of these repurposed factories were the former aircraft plants, such as those of Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Nakajima, located primarily in the cities of Nagoya and Kobe. These had been among the busiest and most advanced industrial sites in Japan before the war. In the years following the war, they stood as ghostly reminders of a past that could no longer be denied. It wasn't until the early 1950s, after much economic upheaval, that these plants began to find new purposes. Mitsubishi, which had once built the infamous A6M0 fighter plane, began retooling its Nagoya aircraft factory to accommodate automobile production. However, this was not an easy or swift transformation. The factory's original machinery, designed to make precise parts for aircraft, was ill-suited for the mass production of automobiles. The transition would take years, during which time the factory stood largely idle. Yet, Mitsubishi's ability to transform itself from an engine of war production to a civilian powerhouse marked the beginning of Japan's industrial rebirth. By the mid-1950s, this same factory was cranking out the first models of the Mitsubishi 500, an early mass-market car that would serve as a precursor to the company's later success in the automotive industry. This was not only a remarkable feat of industrial conversion but also a demonstration of Japan's resilience in adapting its wartime infrastructure to peacetime needs. However, not all factories were so fortunate. Many of Japan's war factories, particularly those in the less industrialized regions, were abandoned entirely. Cities like Yokohama and Sasebo, which had once been bustling centers of war production, now saw their industrial hubs fall silent. These abandoned sites were not only eyesores but also symbols of Japan's broken economy. With limited financial resources and no immediate demand for military goods, these factories were left to decay. Large portions of Japan's military shipyards, for example, were simply shut down. The massive docks that once housed enormous battleships and aircraft carriers now standing idle, exposed to the elements. Yet, the need for economic recovery could not be ignored. Over time, some of these abandoned sites were repurposed for non-military civilian uses. In the case of shipyards, some were eventually retooled for the burgeoning commercial shipbuilding industry. This shift, while effective in generating economic activity, further highlighted the difficulty of transitioning from a war economy to a peace economy. The labor force that had once been employed in military production had to adjust to civilian industries. The transformation was not always easy, as many workers had spent decades in the military-industrial sector and were unfamiliar with civilian production methods. Training new workers in this context became an essential part of rebuilding Japan's industrial capacity. By the early 1950s, Japan's industrial base began to show signs of recovery, but the costs were evident. The process of demilitarization and the abandonment of entire factories had not only been financially draining but emotionally exhausting for the Japanese people. In particular, those who had worked in the war factories found themselves caught in a transition that didn't offer the same kind of pride or purpose that their previous roles had. The factories were no longer dedicated to the production of warplanes or tanks, but to more mundane, everyday goods. While these goods were necessary for Japan's recovery, they lacked the sense of nationalistic glory that had accompanied wartime production. In some ways, the factories' repurposing felt like a betrayal to those who had worked in them, especially to the older generations who had built their lives around the ideals of wartime Japan. Meanwhile, the factories that had been completely abandoned or demolished were slowly being replaced by new, modern facilities. A new industrial order began to take shape in Japan, one that was no longer tied to military needs but focused on producing goods for the consumer market. Japan's post-war industrial revival was deeply influenced by foreign investment and international markets. With the easing of occupation controls and the growing demand for consumer goods in the West, Japan was able to tap into its manufacturing capabilities and began exporting products on a scale not seen since before the war. This economic boom was driven by Japan's ability to convert its wartime industrial infrastructure into civilian production. However, the process was far from seamless. For many, the remnants of the war economy continued to cast a long shadow. The most poignant legacy of Japan's abandoned war factories came in the form of lost opportunity. There were, undoubtedly, resources tied up in these massive industrial plants. Resources that, had they been more effectively repurposed or preserved, could have accelerated Japan's recovery. But in the immediate post-war period, Japan simply didn't have the time, the political will, or the economic stability to focus on anything other than the most urgent needs: demilitarization, rebuilding, and surviving.